Welcome to Saturday Morning Trek, just one of many podcasts on Trek FM. If you'd like to help keep Star Trek discussion coming your way each day, consider becoming a network patron through Patreon. Visit patreon.com/trekfm and find out how you can become part of the team. That's patreon.com/trekfm.
This is Walter Koenig, Chekhov from Star Trek, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Now for action and adventure. Future's here for us to see. It's 2200 AD.
Their mission, to fight injustice, to right that which is wrong, and
to boldly go where no man has gone before.
Welcome to Saturday Morning Trek. Join us at Trek FM as we harken back to the days of wood-paneled dens, console televisions, and a time when Ron Howard was doing Saturday morning cartoon voiceover work. I'm Aaron Harvey, and today we're happy to have Rich Handley in the wood-paneled den. Welcome, Rich.
Nice paneling, and thank you for welcoming me.
You're welcome. And you are the... I guess author's not the right word. It's the compiler, or?
Yeah, Amazon lists me as author, but that's really taking far too much credit. Basically, I am an author, but not of this. It's my collection that's being reprinted in these books that you're going to be discussing. And I also wrote the introduction and some other supplementary materials and was an assistant editor on the project.
Cool. This is Star Trek, the classic UK comics, and we're talking about Volume 1, 1969 to 70, which came out just at the end of April.
Yes.
So a lot of people don't know about the UK comics. They know about the Gold Key comics, which this shares sort of a kinship with because it has some of that craziness and offness, to the Star Trek world. Do you want to give us a little bit of a history about how these stories came to be?
Sure. I kind of see the UK strips as the Gold Key strips if the Gold Key strips were doing acid. That's basically what they are. You take those comics and take them one step further and you have the UK strips, because you can never have enough lunacy. I think that seems to have been the approach they took. But that said, I should preface everything I'm about to say with, I freaking love these comic strips. I am not in any way bashing them or implying anyone shouldn't read them or that they aren't going to be laughing hysterically the whole time because they're great. They are, however, Gold Key on acid. It's just simply unavoidable. Basically, back in the 60s, there were British magazines, British comic magazines were very different than the American comic magazines, where you had one story of Batman, one issue of Batman, which had a full issue story. But in the UK, you'd end up with titles like, for example, these issues, Joe 90, TV 21, Valiant, but there were a bunch of others, Beano, there are a ton of them. And they would have 2 to 3 page spreads for, say, 10, 15 different stories.
And these magazines were kind of the equivalent of TV Guide, is that correct?
No, I mean, actually, no, it's, if I know, I can ship you one if you want to see one, but
that'd be great.
No, they're just comic strips.
Okay.
There are magazines like Lookin', for example, I believe may have had some listings if I remember correctly. I'm not sure if others did. These are basically just adventure strips.
Okay. Were they reprinted in any other magazine? Because it feels like maybe it was the Doctor Who strips or something. I'm thinking that sort of made the rounds in different places.
Yeah, I know that the Doctor Who strips have appeared in a number of different magazines, and they've shown up. And I'm not an expert on the Jerry Anderson Supermarionation strips, which is the core of these magazines. Mm-hmm. But I'm pretty sure some of these have also been reprinted elsewhere. Okay. You'll find in these sorts of magazines things like Dan Dare, not in these particular ones, but in 2000 AD. You'll find a lot of British comic magazines will have different stories running, and some of them are original stories, some are what they call boys' adventure stories, and in the case of Star Trek, licensed stories. Star Trek being one, there was also Land of the Giants, there were a few others. And they basically started off at 2 pages per spread. Star Trek eventually moved on to 3 pages per issue rather. And so they're serialized. One story may be anywhere from 4 to 10 or 12 issues. So they all ended on a cliffhanger. It was kind of like watching Doctor Who. You couldn't end an issue without Kirk meeting a giant robot or just some horrible thing every 12 panels. You have to wonder why these guys just didn't quit and take up knitting, because it was incredibly dangerous.
Well, it's the age-old question of, like, why would anyone take a commission on the Enterprise after if you even had the chance to read a fraction of the logs or at least hear about your well, my friend worked on the Enterprise and wow, did you
for 12 minutes, and then he got turned into a rock. Yeah.
I believe there have been some books where they have brought that up. There was a recent it was like The Later Fire, I believe, by James Swallow, where Eric's comes on from the animated series. It's his transition and Chekhov is leaving, and he mentioned something about it's like, I always thought that Chekhov was, just exaggerating everything that happened. It's like, now I know he's not.
Exactly. It's funny. You have to wonder why anybody would ever go into any career in Starfleet that involved a red shirt. And I know it's a cliche, but even the people in Starfleet must be aware that almost everyone else in their graduating class was dead within 3 weeks of their first assignment. So,
well, the great thing about the UK comics is you can have a wide variety of shirt colors. You can have green.
That is true.
There's a lot of colors that you don't see.
It was like a game. You didn't know from day to day if you were going to be the red shirt, and that included Kirk. He very often was the guy in the red shirt, which may explain why he was in peril so often.
Actually, okay, let's before we get into sort of that the memes, I guess, or not memes, but what is the just sort of the overall story arcs that kept happening. Can we talk a little bit about the art? Is pretty amazing, even though yes, it is crazy. There are some beautiful panels and stuff, but unlike American comics that sort of they always talk about the writers, the artists, and that's sort of put on the front of the magazine, and then it's put on the inside fold. A lot of that information wasn't originally posted, and it's still hard to find. It sounds like the writers, even like who put these stories together.
Sadly, the credits on these strips were often overlooked, and which tells you, a lot of times we in the writing business will complain about being devalued as writers, but at least my name appears on stuff I've written. I really can't complain compared to the poor guys who wrote these strips. Looking over my records, I'm looking down a list of credits for each one, and I see writer unknown. Most of these are unknown. I mean, we know that Jack Sutter wrote a couple of the annual stories. There's rumors over who may have written things, but the truth, and Angus Allen comes to mind, but the truth is most of these are unknown. Now, luckily, we do know most of the artists, but and there was Todd Sullivan who may have written a few. Angus Allen, I think, wrote the earlier ones. Yeah, I had looked it up for a second.
Is he the one who mentioned at a convention that he had written? Okay, yeah, that was.
I know exactly what you're going to say, but please go ahead.
No, you tell the listeners about this story. This was pretty interesting.
Oh, is it? Are you talking about the fact that his use of terminology that was just wrong? Being a British writer, it's understandable that he used. I'm sure he tried to keep things American, but part of the problem was that the team really wasn't all that familiar with the show. I mean, it's a lot of it is anecdotal. Since we don't know who writers were, it's hard to tell what they had. But it seems that they may have basically had access to one episode. Whether it was the full episode, I don't know, but it seems to have been the Corbomite maneuver. And so you end up with a lot of oddities in the writing, and the Britishisms would be one of them. Although it is, you could argue, a British series. I mean, it's saying Skipper would have seemed totally normal to the right. British readers. When the show started airing or became popular in the UK, I'm sure people called Angus Allen on it, which is what he was referring to in that article. There were other things too. For example, there were a couple points where McCoy was called Mac instead of Bones. Mm-hmm. So there were things that didn't ring true, but that's part of the charm.
Well, and one of the things that they don't ever mention it is clearly ignored if they had is the Prime Directive, which is something
what's that?
Yeah. Well, and also when they were writing this, I don't believe the Prime Directive was actually in the show in the United States yet either. So
probably not. No, I had to think of the time on that. I think you're right.
Yeah, I don't think that came about until I want to say the Omega Glory. I think it's when they actually literally used the term.
Which would have been after the point where the strip started.
Right. And there's no Chekhov either, because Chekhov wasn't in the first season.
But there is Navigator Dave Bailey, who apparently is a recurring regular character on Star Trek, if you ask the British writers. He was in the first 7 stories and one of the annuals. Because of Corbin My Maneuver being used as reference material. And I've always liked to believe that at some point someone pulled them aside and went, guys, because Bailey just vanishes without a trace on the strip at some point. Chekhov does not show up yet, but he will later. At some point, somebody went, hey, you know that navigator spot we emptied out? We probably should put the right guy in that chair. And so they do at some point.
Well, and Sulu was often seen in the armaments. He was off doing things that really didn't fit in his helm position.
Or botany, depending on what episode you're watching.
That's true.
However, I will say this. This is one case where the writers just got damn lucky, because Sulu is also a weapons fan. So this is a guy who collects weaponry. Maybe he, on his off hours, hung out as an armaments officer. Who knows? They got lucky on that one. I can't cut them as much slack for Captain Kurt and Lieutenant Uhuru, but at least we can say the armaments officer kind of made sense.
Yeah, the names were interesting, and also just the physical look of some of the things. Frank Bellum, who also drew Thunderbirds, drew some of these. He was also responsible for the really cool look of how the panels sort of all break, and basically it's much more dynamic than your a traditional grid system. So that was pretty cool.
The layout on these things is brilliant. I cannot. Okay, yeah, we can point out that things don't look like they're supposed to, but this is sort of an alternate universe where the technology doesn't look like it did on TV, and in some ways it looks cooler. I mean, some of these ship designs and weapon designs and alien designs they came up with are breathtaking.
Yeah,
they look dated and they don't quite match what we saw, but if you see this as these are people who weren't constrained. They were just told, come up with entertaining stories. And as I pointed out in the introduction, in that regard, they succeeded brilliantly, because these stories may be off. Kirk may be teaching, gorillas to play soccer, and that's not an exaggeration. He does. So the stories may be things like they may have giant blocky robots that belong on the cover of an Amazing Stories issue from many decades ago, but it doesn't matter because it's just so much fun.
Yeah. Well, and there's also, we have other properties that sort of sneak their way in. And we have, at least until, I think a few stories in, all of their shuttlecraft are basically Thunderbirds vehicles, which makes sense because Frank also wrote... Space Bugs, yes. Space Buggy?
Space Wagons, I'm sorry.
We had the repair wagons.
Actually, repair wagon, that's what I was trying to say. They sort of went back and forth. They were called repair wagons, but then even though they were repair wagons, they'd be Space Bug 5 and Space Bug 4, which apparently are repair wagons. So, and
they had some really cool shots of those repair wagons working on the nacelles and doing other things. It was just sort of like you were saying, there were some things that were actually kind of cooler. One of the things I noticed in the technology was they were talking about that they used navigation lasers and the star cameras and different things. It was much more realistic about how you might actually navigate rather than just like magic. I don't know. It's like,
probably I think that's because the writers, because they didn't know the terminology, because they didn't know what technology was used, had to come up with it on their own, and so they based it on what to them made sense.
Well, and what was current with space exploration. Yeah. And
they weren't constrained by budgetary restraints, which is why restrained by restraints. That's great, Rich. Anyway, that's why we have examples of what you said about them being outside doing extravehicular repairs. On a TV show that either would have been cost prohibitive or would have just looked like Lost in Space. It would never have come off like it does in this story.
Yeah.
And, you may find yourself cracking up every time Kirk says suffering starships, or Spock has an exclamation point or 7 at the end of every single line of dialogue.
He's shouty Spock, like from the very first episode.
Exactly. But that being said, it's even with that, these strips are great to look at, and there's a lot of imagination in them, in my opinion. I've always been very much a proponent of these, even as I crack up or cringe or just plain cry while reading them.
Well, when you look at the ship, basically the Enterprise, if we go, take that as sort of, it's a character in itself, and it has its own odd variations. But
the Earthship Enterprise?
The Earthship Enterprise, yes.
Yeah.
It is massive in proportion because it's manned by thousands.
Absolutely. We all knew this to be the case, yes.
The transporter room, or what did they get? They didn't call it a transporter.
Beam materializer was, although it had about 8 different names, it depended on what story you were reading.
It was cathedral looking, like the whole room was huge, which when you think about what a transporter does...
You would think it would need to be a bigger room than that.
Yeah, so I think that kind of is... I cut that some slack. I like that.
It's the equivalent of J.J. Abrams engineering, basically.
Yeah, that is true.
Could dematerialize somebody and make beer at the same time.
I buy that better than the engine. Like, yeah. Anyway, they didn't use the transporter as much. They did use shuttlecraft more often, but when they did, occasionally they would use transgalactic transporters. They beamed to another galaxy once.
And you have to wonder, if they could do that, why did they have what can only be described as an armada of shuttles? There was an endless supply of shuttles of various designs, and at some point somebody pointed out to them, I assume, right, probably around the same week they pointed out that Chekhov should be sitting there. By the way, there's this one shuttle called the Galileo. Use that design. So the artist went, great, and then called every single shuttle Galileo.
With different numbers.
And they all blew up. So basically they kept destroying the Galileo and then coming up with another one that was always either 7 or 8. Although there's 1 or 2 in the lower numbers, but they're all mostly 7 or 8, and they all blow up. In fact, what's great is, I forget which story it is, there's one where you see a whole fleet of Galileos all numbered 7. Like, how do you even identify these things? There's like 6 of them in a shot, and they all have the same number.
That's hilarious. Yeah, I think I remember that's towards the end of the book, I believe.
Yeah. Maybe it's because Starfleet figures it's a lucky number. We keep losing these things. We'll name them all 7. There's less of a chance of them exploding by story's end.
I like their spacesuits too, because they feel much more like 2001, and they
very much so.
They look a lot better than the sparkly disco, whatever uniform or spacesuit it was in TOS.
That explains why when people read it, they find themselves saying, "What are you doing, Britain?"
Yeah, I really think that some of the technology they had made more sense. They also, when they went on away missions, had backpacks and sort of like their whole away uniform, basically.
They took half the ship with them, yeah.
Well, yeah, that's true.
And then they gave it away.
at the drop of a hat or a one pen knife or something, yeah. Actually, let's see. There was the one episode. There's the one story that had, I swear, Planet of the Apes. It was, they were obviously, a race of super intelligent simians. That's fine, but the way they were even drawn and their clothing, everything.
Yeah, they're actually wearing the apes suits, and they're very clearly drawn like John Chambers makeup.
Yeah, it looked
so
like
naturally,
Zira.
They had to learn Stalker at the end, because that's what you do when you meet Planet of the Apes.
And Spock is super intelligent. It's been reiterated by all of the crew members that he is just beyond anybody's comprehension, and that he,
like the many stupid things he does. Yes, they keep reminding us this.
And well, he also has a kinship with machines, more so than people.
He also basically is repeatedly told, and this part the writers got right, that he's supposed to be non-emotional. Except that he keeps screaming everything, jumping Jupiter, skipper,
He also, his logic is a little bit muddled. It was like there was one where they walked in, it's like, where have they all gone? Have they all melted away? Yes, Spock, they melted. Like, Spock would never say that. But so.
In all fairness to him, they had just shown Raiders of the Lost Ark in the ship's theater the night before, and he had this melty thing going on in his head. Everything was melted to him that week.
Did they mention movies? I'm trying to remember if there was in the.
I don't even know that they ever mentioned any entertainment. These people seem to do nothing but fight monsters and robots and so forth, and yell at each other.
And there's no romance. Like in TOS, we would actually get, at least Kirk would go after someone, or even if it was misogynistic, at least we got it. And this
basically is a crew of eunuchs and Uhura.
Yes.
Basically, that seems to be the case.
And she never has her hand moved away from her head. She always has, it's the cupped ear thing where she, like, even when she's in a scene where she's not on any kind of communication, her hand is up to her ear. It's very strange.
Well, it's not attached.
No.
Her ear, it's going to fall off.
Oh, okay. So it's just holding the ear.
Right.
And the way she's drawn, she sometimes looks like a Caucasian with brown skin, or it's like they didn't quite know how to draw her, and then suddenly she becomes almost photorealistic. It's like, oh, they got good photos of her, and now they can really draw her. So I thought that was interesting.
Which is interesting because that predates the Peter Pan records, in which she was Caucasian.
And Sulu was black.
Sulu was black. And God only knows what Maress was. Some sort of weird Ryan / I don't know what that was. Who knows?
She was a furry cosplayer or something like that. Or
she wasn't even furry. She was a blue-skinned human.
Oh, that's true. She was more kind of...
Who said "rawr" a lot.
And tying this all back into the animated series, it's kind of amazing when you watch the animated series how much they did get right and how not off of Star Trek it actually is compared to.
Well, when you have the same writers, Gene Roddenberry, and all but one of the cast, it's you're going to be a lot closer on than a bunch of people who have never seen it. Which again is not meant to denigrate the writers and artists at all.
No.
I would never have spent all this time trying to get these things published if I disliked them. But I think the animated series had several distinct advantages over what came before.
And one of the things that the comics predicted was that there would be children on the Enterprise.
Yes.
In one issue, there was, and I can't remember exactly how it was phrased, but basically you saw children run by and they were just like, protect the kids. And I'm just like, wow. Yeah,
but when you consider how much peril this crew faces, why would anyone bring their kids on this ship? But this is a ship where at any given moment, asteroids and meteors are just waiting to pummel the hull.
Well, that's a good transition into sort of what some of the stories basically entailed, and we've kind of hinted at the fact that that Kirk would surrender at the drop of a hat. But so basically, a lot of these they would be exploring, and they seem like they were on star charting missions quite a bit, which was very similar to the animated series.
And by the way, they were in different galaxies. And occasionally in different universes. This is the naming that they would say. You haven't read all the stories yet, but I think, right, because you haven't seen the other two.
There's a couple at the end I haven't caught yet.
Yeah. I mean, in the next two volumes.
I haven't read all those, no. Yeah,
the terminology that they use in naming where they're from, it seems like every Tuesday they go to a different galaxy.
Well, there was, what is it, the Japanese monster movies that they would translate and bring to America. They would do things like, it's like, oh, they're from another star. And on their star, they, it's like, no, it's a planet. And Mystery Science Theater, that was kind of a famous bit where they would just start screaming at the screen. It's like, planet! So...
My friend Tim and I have been doing Godzilla marathons for the past year plus. I've been introducing him to all these films, and yet I still call him a friend, so go figure. In any case, so we're almost up to the current ones, and one of the things that he consistently cracks up about is the fact that nobody in a Godzilla film seems to understand astronomy. And I think that if aliens are from another planet, they're from another star galaxy system universe. And so, so that's you get a little bit of that here as well. But a large part of that goes back to what you said about the prime directive. The writers simply didn't know. So it's easy to excuse them because they weren't just being lackadaisical. No one told them, stay in this galaxy. I'll tell you something. Give you some interesting insight as to why that might be the case. Years ago, when I was when I first started trying to get these things reprinted, before IDW, I'd gone to Wildstorm, to Pocket Books, I'd gone to GIT Core when they had done their CD-ROM of all the comic book scans. Mm-hmm. And everybody wanted to do it. Wildstorm's Jeff Marriott and John Ordover at Pocket and so forth. These guys all wanted to do it. I actually reached out to Maisel Roddenberry and asked her. Oh, wow. I was still missing some issues at that point. They were not easy to find in the early days of the internet for an American. And I reached out to her, and her first response was, "I don't know what you're talking about." Now, keep in mind that she and her husband ran Lincoln Enterprises, which back in the 70s, basically handled Star Trek merchandise. And she had no idea these things existed. So she was surprised to find out that these things had copyright data, and they were, in fact, licensed by Paramount.
Wow.
So So that gives you some insight into why things were done the way they were. If the people in charge, because she asked her son, her husband, and nobody. Actually, I guess at this point, Gene was probably already dead, but I know she asked her son.
But she would have been running Lincoln Enterprises at that time, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And her first response was, and she was really nice. It's great that she got back to me, but her initial response was to say these don't exist, and then I sent her. Or they're not licensed. And so I sent her some scans, and she said, what the? She looked into it and said, yeah, these are actually official, but wow, no one ran them past us. So if that's the case, it's not surprising that nobody was reaching out to the writers and saying, okay, prime directive, don't leave the galaxy. Spock is a Vulcan, not a Vulcanian. Okay, sometimes he was a Vulcanian on TV, but he's not a Vulcanite, whatever.
Volcanologist.
Yeah, exactly. A volcano. And so nobody, McCoy's name is not Mac, Bailey. The funny thing about Bailey, by the way, is he's gone by the end of the episode. So it's even funny to me that they even made him a regular character because he's not even on the ship at the end of the episode. But putting that aside.
Maybe these predate that episode. You never know.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe they were missing the last 5 minutes. But this is why there clearly wasn't a lot of oversight. And when the people who own the franchise, or I shouldn't say own it, when the people who are at the top of the franchise don't know, it says it.
Well, even with animated series, I'll talk with authors who, have written episodes, and I said, what do you think about the novelization that Alan Dean Foster did? And they're like, what are you talking about? I'm like, they had books all through the 70s with the episodes turned into. He's like, what? And I would actually send them the book, and they're just like, wow, I didn't even know this existed. And it's just like,
and where's my royalty check?
Yeah, well, that was maybe I shouldn't have said that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it is interesting. This is sort of part of what our show talks about. Is just this. There's all these bits and bobs and stuff of lost Star Trek floating out there from the 70s, where people just weren't connected. It's like you've got the Mego figures, you've got all these, and the oversight of them was thin to none. It seemed like it was just like, well, yeah, you can buy that license, and as long as you pay us X money.
If you've ever read the 2 strips that were included in Laramie's Star Trek Space Viewer, I think nothing backs up what you just said better than this. They make the McDonald's Happy Meal strips look like Shakespeare in the original Klingon.
I have a Happy Meal from the motion picture of a Klingon Happy Meal, actually.
I have them all.
Hey.
In fact, in the previous books, the ones reprinting the U.S. strips, those scans at the back are actually of my boxes. So
nice. Yes, and we're actually eventually we will have you on when we get towards the motion picture time to talk about the motion picture strips.
Those are fun.
Yes.
We're going to have fun talking about those. They're extremely good.
And they actually are good stories. I mean, they have great arcs and stuff like that.
And for the most part are well drawn.
Yes.
Whereas this era is more kitschy. This era is just fun for the sake of just saying, wow, this is silly.
McDonald. For you parents who don't speak Klingonese, he's saying, people of Earth, unite and bring your kids to McDonald's for a Star Trek meal. That's a regular hamburger, fries, soft drink, a McDonald and cookie sampler, and a Star Trek prize. Oh, yes, 5 different boxes based on Star Trek the Motion Picture. Action scenes, jokes, games. He says, take it from a father who knows. His kids love him. McDonald's Star Trek meal available for your kids now.
What I really appreciated is that not every starship that they ran across had 2 nacelles. It was like, okay, one of them looked like a flying lipstick, but some of them had really interesting.
I think they all should have looked like flying lipsticks. It's funny that one of my favorite stories, actually, and I don't remember if it's in this first volume. I'd have to look it up. But one of my favorite stories actually involves another starship. It's called the Dorado. And does this sound familiar to you? Spock's cousin Horik?
No. Oh.
Okay, so it's probably...
No, I think it's in the next volume, yeah.
Okay, so Spock, there's a mutiny on this other starship, the Dorado, and it's got some of the same writing problems in terms of terminology and so forth, but it's genuinely a good, well-written story, and it involves Spock's cousin Horik, who's a lieutenant on the ship, caught up in the middle of it. It's pretty cool. And, that might, if I can remember correctly, might be the only time the British strips introduced a family member for anybody. Because much like romance, these people had no families either. But Spock's cousin Horik was caught up in the middle of a mutiny. So, if you're going to do something, go big, I guess.
Well, they definitely go big in a lot of these. Just looking at the story, you've got these great strips where, we always joke that, J.J. Abrams put the Enterprise underwater. It's like, a crazy. No, they did that in the British comics. They were underwater. And
they also did something pretty funny, which is the British strips never did sequels to television episodes. But there is one that you could sort of call a sequel, which is that they go to the Sigma Draconis system. And that has always struck me as hilarious, because that means the only sequel that the British strips did were to Spock's brain. Of all things to have a tie into. Now, it's purely coincidental. I am sure the writers chose Sigma Draconis from the star chart and had no idea that this is where the people who are not Morgs or I-Morgs live. So, it's coincidental, but it did strike me as funny that was actually one of the very few connections you can make in a TV show.
Sequel and sequel. What is sequel?
Exactly. Continuity. What is continuity? Yeah.
There is it's just and we'll try and put a couple of screenshots up in the Babel conference when we release this. But there are just some really beautiful pictures. There's also some really interesting aliens. That actually, there's one that is like, wow, that's genuinely creepy. And I think if you look at sort of the people who brought you Doctor Who, they do a good job of having creepy aliens that would scare children. And I think that some of these, there's this one where it's just sort of kind of like a big bear. It almost looks like but it looks like a hand, and then it looks like there's a face in the middle of the hand. You're just like, it's just weird. It's a little offsetting.
They have some cool ones coming up in the next volume. There's some just genuinely weird-looking alien people. One of the things they often fall back on, though, are bald-headed people wearing purple. I'm not entirely sure why, but there's a lot of planets out there inhabited by bald people with purple fascinations. I guess they're like the Centauri from Babylon 5, but without hair.
And they have the robes. They all tend to have like...
everyone wears a robe.
Yeah.
It's fashionable right now. Everyone knows this.
There's a lot of there was one in volume 1 where they ran into, it was like the Galactic Union, and it seemed like it's sort of a different federation. It was just like I'm surprised that we haven't in Star Trek run into more of these. We've got the Romulan.
Well, there's the first Federation, but we never heard from them again. And from interestingly enough, Corbin might maneuver.
There you go.
But yeah, you're right. Really, there's not. I actually thought it was kind of cool that you had the Galactic Union in there. I would have liked to see more of that. Although every time that they found one of these other federations, so to speak, we didn't see them again.
No, and I think the Galactic Union was also the story where they were kind of brainwashing children. I think, and Kirk decided that I'm just going to, non-existing Prime Directive be damned. I'm going to go free these children and not let they basically. I think that the idea was that they took the kids and they indoctrinated them in some sort of like kind of a war camp, basically.
Yeah, it was kind of like a Hitler's Youth type of thing,
or children soldiers, or whatever. Yeah, exactly. And so they went to go rescue them, and they're like, "Oh, these kids will be so happy that we freed them," and then the kids attack them. So
yeah, it's not the brightest of Kirk's moves. I mean, the great motives maybe, but not the most well thought out of the plots. But the funny thing is that basically Kirk's reaction to a lot of things in the British strips is, "Oh, you're doing something we don't like, fire." But then
Spock too.
Yeah. Oh, Spock is bloodthirsty. He's downright bloodthirsty. Captain, shouldn't we fire at them now? Well, they threw a paperclip at us. That seems to be Spock's reaction to a lot of stories.
He's the Worf of this story, basically.
Exactly. Except that people half his size don't keep beating him up. Otherwise, he's Worf-like. Yeah.
That's true. So as far as like the physical production of the book, what were some of the challenges that you went through, like with the scans? And because you and I have been talking about this offline a little bit about ways to take old stories that have been printed, and when you don't have the original source material, and trying to get rid of the print effect.
Exactly. Well, here's the thing. There were 257 weekly issues, plus 6 hardcover annuals, plus a couple of other is a summer special and a issue of Radio Times. So really, you're talking about a lot of material. 259 issues total in 6 books, and The challenge is that while there are some existing examples of the original artwork that people have in their collections, being able to find what is probably well over 1,000 pages would have been nearly impossible. But even if it were possible, certainly would have been cost prohibitive. I certainly would never have done that, and I doubt IDW wanted to. They'd have to sell so many copies and wait 10 years before putting the books out.
Yeah.
So what they were stuck with was my collection. Now, it just so happens that it's complete, which made things a whole lot easier. That by the time I had gotten around to pitching it to IDW, I had filled it in, and they're all in great shape, but they are in fact printed on newsprint in the 60s and 70s.
Right.
And some of them are yellowed and so forth. I mean, they're in as great shape as you can find at this point, but reprinting them proved challenging. However, and I can't speak to what went on the scanning end, because that was done by Dean Mullaney at Library of American Comics. That's IDW imprint that's producing these. But I was in regular contact with Dean, and I know that he spent basically what he did was scan every issue at absurdly high number DPI, and then just played with it. And what you end up with is frankly better than I would have thought possible. When he sent me the PDF of the book, I was floored at how great these strips look. It's he did, there's posterity here. I mean, they look like what they did originally, just 10 times better. It's kind of like when Next Generation was put out on Blu-ray, and we realized just how much information had been there to begin with, at least most of the sets.
Well, yeah, and some of the stuff we probably shouldn't have seen, like
exactly, yeah,
screws on pads and things like that.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of what happened here. He did these things have never looked better. But the challenge then was to get these newsprint stories to something that was reprintable by 2016 standards. I think he did a great job. What the problem was, for the first 50 plus stories, is that the earliest issues, or 50 plus issues rather, not 50 plus stories, but the first 50 plus issues were actually 2-page spreads across the fold. That created an issue because these books are not across the fold. The books actually bend at the spine, whereas because these old comics, they it wasn't like they laid completely flat, and Star Trek was in the center, so the art just ran right across. Reprinting that with a fold is a problem. So the Dean spoke with the printer, who then they came up with a way of printing the book so that if you very gently well, basically, there's 2 spines. There's the hardcover one on the outside, and there's a softer one that is supposed to separate from the outer one, and that actually allows the book to recreate the effect of the original strips. The unfortunate thing was that it seemed like a number of copies had glue that leaked, I guess, from one spine to the other, and a lot of people, and by the way, that includes me and Dean.
And mine as well.
Yeah, there you go. So Dean and I, when we got our copies, were both like, well, oh, God, this is not good. And people are writing to me saying,
I can't read it.
I can't read it. Yeah, I'm missing 5% of every issue. So
I was one of those people who contacted you and was like,
as a matter of fact, you were. That's right. So we went to the printer, and they explained, well, here's what you do, very gently. And there's a page, actually, there's IDW's blog actually has a post about this. If you type in, if you go to IDW's, I should say to the Library of American Comics blog and type in Star Trek, it will pop up. I think it says Star Trek Lays Flat, I think is what the name of the blog post was, or something like that. And
we can link to that in our show notes as well.
Yeah, it'll be really easy to find because it's one of the only Star Trek blog posts on Library of American Comics site. But basically, if you very gently pop the two spines apart, it will lay flat and you will not remotely damage your book. I say that with confidence because Dean and I were both panic-stricken about damaging our copies of the book after all this work went into it.
Yeah, I did it with somebody watching me. I said, okay, I'm going to do this. And it's like, if you think that something looks like it's going to pull apart, you watch over here. And I'm like,
That's so funny because I did exactly the same thing. I had a friend with me when I did it. I was just watch that side. I do not wish to damage this hardcover book after spending 20 years trying to get these.
It's a great book. And it just it has a bookmark built into it, which is really cool. I appreciated that. Yeah.
Very old style. I like that.
Yeah. And I'm looking forward to the next prints. And I did notice, and I'm guessing that this is the one strip, or the way it was. It's about page 180. where they go back to Earth, which looks a little bit like I want to say 1960s military, which is supposed to be, I guess, the future. I thought it was a time travel story for a second, but it's sort of offset printing, and I'm guessing it's the original was just maybe not a perfect print because you get a little bit of that almost blurry newspaper sort of feel, or it could be micro.
Just so we have the same page, it's got the Enterprise like a reddish orange background. This,
yes,
we have the same page. Could be. I'd have to go look at the originals to tell. I mean, some of them were in better shape than others, so that may very well have been the case.
But just the fact that they're from the 70s and that you were able to put them, like you said, these don't look like they're newspapers that have been scanned. They're amazing.
Crazy thing.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that I even had all these is still pretty astounding. I mean, I'm sure there are other people out there, but I have yet to meet anyone who has a complete set of these things. It's that hard to find. I'm sure they exist, and you will be hit with 256 comments saying I'm an arrogant idiot and they have a complete set, and in fact they have 5 extras. But I've never met anybody who has them.
Well, I know digital copies have been sort of floating around for a while, and I don't know if they're complete digital copies, but...
It's funny you should say that, because there's actually a side story to that one. Years ago, I had given up after Wildstorm and Pocket had both been unable to, despite their best efforts. But I had people saying they wanted copies, and I didn't want to damage my copy. I mean, I had these. Some of them were a little brittle, and I just knew if I kept opening these things to read them, I was eventually going to damage them. So I spent a lot of hours after hours at the job I worked at the time, because thankfully I had a large flatbed scanner in my office, and I scanned them all. And at the top of every page, I made a little notation in case I get confused later on what they were. So it would say TV 21 issue number 1, TV 21 issue number 2. I saved all these things on discs, and I disseminated these to friends of mine. And I ended up probably giving out maybe 100 copies, but we're going back like 17 years. These things are now all over the web. I was viral before people were viral, and yet no one has any idea they're from me, thankfully, because that probably would have been a problem.
I can edit this.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's okay. Actually, I've told Dean, and he was laughing about it. The reason I know that the ones out there are mine is because of those notations at the top. So what happens is every now and then someone will say, hey, did you know about this? And they'll forward me a link to some site that's got some, I bet you didn't know about this Star Trek comic. And I crack up because I know before I open it, in the top left corner is going to be a little blurb that says Joe 90 Top Secret, issue 23. And I'm
yes, that's my handwriting. I know about that.
I scan that, yes.
That's hilarious.
So the ones that are out there, most likely, if they say, because I should say this because people will notice in the book, if they've seen all those scans over the years, they may be expecting those notations at the top, but they don't exist in the comics. That's mine. So if people are going, hey, they cut those off at the top, shoddy workmanship. No, they're just not in the comic. That's me in case I idiotically dropped all the scans.
That is hilarious. So this is volume 1, and there's 2 more volumes. Is that correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, Star Trek ran in Joe 90 Top Secret. It ran in 34 issues of that. And then Joe 90 transferred over, combined with a magazine called TV 21. So it became TV 21 and Joe 90. And that ran for 105 issues. And then TV 21 at some point dropped out to Joe 90 and just became TV 21. And then it merged with Valiant again and continued as Valiant and TV 21 for 118 issues. So what you have as a result of that are a whole lot of pages and different creative teams. Even if we don't know who they are,
yeah.
We do know most of the artists, but you could tell both art-wise and writing-wise when things change. The most drastic one is Valiant. When people see Valiant, which will be in the 3rd volume, it really does look like the art is actually pretty accurate. Although everything is orange, yellow, and green, which I find hilarious. It's this very strange and limited color palette, but it actually looks like what it's supposed to. But I prefer the earlier ones. I prefer the painted illustrations.
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit of the when in the 80s when they tried to go with that really bright, like it was a super crisp white paper, and it was like it felt like there was only 3 colors, and it was very, like, no matter what, the sun couldn't bleach them, and but it just had this really cheesy kind of color palette. And when I saw those, I was just like, oh, that's interesting, because and they're hard to clean up. It seems like it's visually.
Yeah,
just
well, I'm
because,
wondering what Dean's going to do because he's working on the second book right now. The cleanup hasn't begun on book 3 yet, and I'm actually pretty anxious to see. We could potentially end up being blinded just by looking at these things. They may become neon. I don't know. It's hard to say, but
yeah, you and I have had conversations about that too.
Exactly, it's going to really pop. I mean, it's but I don't know. I mean, there's only so much you can do with that limited a color palette. It's literally orange, yellow, and green, and some blue. That said, the writing is pretty on par. I mean, if you had the same guy drawing it, you may not even have realized that it switched titles.
Yeah,
the writing's pretty accurate. There are some fun stories. My favorites are probably the ones in the first 2 volumes. I hope that didn't, deter anyone from buying volume 3. But my favorite stories are definitely the ones. Funny thing is, my favorite stories seem to in some way involve prison. I don't know what that says about me.
Yeah, well, your favorites, that's because like 90% of them involve prisons. I think it's like if you have a favorite story, it's because it exists in this universe. Like,
there's 3 in particular that stood out to me. As I was thinking about it while writing the intro. I was like, I want to make sure I highlight a few good stories because here I am making fun of it, but I want to make it clear to people these things are fun. And 3 that really stood out to me. One I had mentioned about Spock's cousin on the ship with Mutiny.
Mm-hmm.
There's another in which it's kind of out of place on the Enterprise, but it's fun. A crew member. It's one of the only times back then that you saw Earth, and Vegas on Earth kind of looks like a madman created Vegas. There's neon signs and casinos, and what seems to be giant roulette wheels everywhere. And but there's an Enterprise crew member ends up in trouble with a mobster, and is going to because he witnesses a murder, and he's being called to testify, and the Enterprise is supposed to bring him, and he's basically chicken shit because you don't mess with mobsters.
That was
even in the 23rd century.
That was the one, I think, where it starts off where he says he's out looking for some boys or something like that. And I was like, oh, that's an interesting twist on like, oh, he's looking for the boys or something. It's just the way it was written. It was
catch that. Yeah, that's pretty funny. Yeah. Well, hey,
I know. I was like, oh, hey, this is going to be really progressive. Nope.
Hey, the British strips are also one of the only times, except in the novels, where you'll see Uhura occasionally giving commands. So they were accidentally progressive. So who knows?
Well, yeah, she got command, and also on TAS twice she was in command of the ship. So
exactly.
So it's funny that it took going to animation or illustration to let her, get her due, basically.
Yeah, I wonder if, I know that we all know all the various stories about censors and so forth.
Right.
But I wonder if they just weren't watching the cartoons, or if it because she wasn't a flesh and blood black woman, it was an animated black woman. I wonder if it was less offensive to the bigots. I don't know. It's hard to say.
I don't know. Maybe they expected her to, start singing like Josie and the Pussycats or something like that, and they're like, "Oh, that'll be acceptable." Or something. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
It was.
But you got also too in the animated series, there were 1 or 2 episodes where she was spotlighted, but for the most part, she was again relegated to sitting in the.
Well, and it basically, unless it was the top 3 or the Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, most of the characters, even the animated, because they only had a half hour, so originally there was not going to be a Sulu or Uhura at all, and the Nimoy pointed out, it's like you are just now you've killed all of your, you've what am I trying to say? You've removed all the diversity of your show, and Filmation was very much about diversity, so that really like freaked them out. They're like, okay, we have to have them in here.
We got it all together now, gang. The Bonds. It's doggy named Mr. Cool and the Good Group. One flaky time machine and a future chick named Cupcake. Oh, now the gang got zapped into that time machine, and they're like traveling through time. My. They do not dig where that machine is going, but they sure hope to get back to 1957 Milwaukee. Can you dig it? Yeah!
Well, when you look at what that era did to Brady Bunch cartoon and Happy Days cartoon and Mork and Mindy and
I Dream of Jeannie.
right. They're not exactly known for being entirely consistent with the source material. Dancing pandas and so forth.
Ping and Pong the Pandas. They're also semi-racist.
But also an example of jettisoning part of the cast. I mean, where are the parents in the Brady Kids cartoon?
They live in a treehouse, of course.
Exactly. So it's not, or the I forget the name of the cartoon where Fonzie and a couple of the guys go into space. I forget what
space. I don't remember that one.
There were a number of Happy Days cartoons.
Wow.
I don't remember if it was just a pilot or if it was a full. But there's something where Spock. I think it's like Spock. Listen to me. Where Fonzie and I'm speaking out my butt here. I think it's Fonzie and I would say Potsy and Ralph, maybe, whatever. They were on some adventure on their own. And this is an example where you jettisoned all the Cunninghams, So it's not surprising to me that they were going to get rid of everybody but Kirk, Spock, and McCoy.
Well, the Partridge Family in space is actually part of the intro to our show. We have like little bits and pieces of clips, and we stitched that in to kind of make a narrative if you listen to it. But I guess at one time on the Howard Stern show, they interviewed Shirley Jones. And they said, what did you think? Were you upset that they didn't ask you to be in the animated series? And she's like, what are you talking about? Like, there's an animated, Partridge Family. It's Partridge Family 2280. And they showed it to her, and she's just like, I have no clue what this is. And
so not one of the kids ever told her about it?
Apparently not. It turns out that they...
One of them is her son.
In real life?
David Cassidy was her stepson.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, no, apparently not. Or just assume that she knew. So it turns out that they used the character from the pilot, which had a different name, and they used that character as the mother as opposed to Shirley Jones. And so,
interesting.
Yeah, and so they got a different actor.
Because she was cheaper? Or it was cheaper not
probably,
to use
yeah, I'm assuming. Especially in the 70s, I think Shirley Jones probably was...
She was hot stuff.
Yeah, she was on Broadway.
The Florence Henderson of Partridge Family.
Basically. So I think it's just really interesting that there's so many of these type of stories in the 1970s where it's almost like, it's not that they didn't care, but it was just like they were just being fast and loose with so many different aspects of pop culture. And then by the 80s, it was sort of like, oh, wait, this is a business, and we might want to kind of bring it all back together and have some rules and tie things together. And then they kind of went overboard. And, in Star Trek, they tried to start shutting down slash fiction and stuff. I remember when the web first, it's just like, nope, we're going to get rid of websites that have Star Trek on it. It's like, kill our advertising, basically.
We see how well that worked.
Yeah.
You know what you said about the times changing? It's interesting. When you look at the 60s and 70s and you see Gold Key and the British strips and the Happy Meals and the Power Records, and even to some extent the animated series, although I really do like the animated series. Mm-hmm. But you see that, and then you jump ahead to what came next, which was, putting aside Marvel's comic, because I'm one of the 4 people in the world who thinks that was good, but when DC took the license and they took it seriously, and you see what DC is doing under Mike Barr and Peter David and so forth, and then you look back at everything else I just mentioned, and you think, wow, it's a huge paradigm shift right there to go from, and it's really a short span of time when you consider that Gold Key ended in 79, and that's around the same time that there were the Power Records stories, right? And then you jump to 84, 83, 84, forget what, 84, I think, when the DC ran. You're really only talking about. Yeah, you're really only talking about a 4 or 5 year span where suddenly Star Trek was being taken extremely seriously in comic book form.
Yeah. And those are some of the best stories, they say, too, just in that
I love them. I'm a big fan, huge fan. For me, that DC run is the most eminently rereadable. And I say that with all due apologies to all my friends who wrote stuff after DC, but I like that too. But the DC run is for me the most rereadable era.
Your other friends have worked on DC comics and stuff. What are some of the things you're doing besides these comics lately? Because I know you've turned into a meme recently. I just saw that from your.
You're partially responsible, yeah. Well, let's see. I'm doing a number of books, have done, and I'm still doing a number of books for Sequart Organization. It's a publisher of comic book and now pop culture based books based on the Planet of the Apes series and Star Wars trilogy. I had done a number of things for the expanded universe in Star Wars before that went the way of the dodo. But the first book each of Planet of the Apes and Star Wars has come out, and also the first book on Star Trek. I had contributed to Sequart's essay book on Star Trek comics. There will be 2 more Star Wars and 1 more Planet of the Apes. Those are both being worked on at the moment with Joe Baronato. And Jim Beard and I have done an officially licensed Planet of the Apes short fiction anthology for Titan Books.
Nice.
That will be out in the early 2017, and will tie in with as a tie into the next film. That'll have a lot of big names like Kevin Anderson, and so there's a lot of others. I'm going to hesitate to name more because I will inevitably forget 3 and then piss people off. So I will just say it is a great lineup. And what else am I working on? I'm working on an unauthorized book about Watchmen. That's almost done. Oh boy, writing for magazines, and then by day I'm a magazine editor in the technical field. So I stay pretty busy.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been really interesting, and I hope that people check out the Star Trek, the classic UK comics, Volume 1, 1969 through 70, and then get the other 2 as they come out.
As do I.
Yes, and remember, yes, you can make this go flat, so you can read all of them. Don't be scared to push it flat and crack that binding.
Everyone I know who tried it has succeeded without breaking the book, and that's a big relief because I would have hated to have seen people breaking their books everywhere. That would have been awful.
And in the world of social media, you would have heard about it and seen it.
Oh, forget social media. I would have had people on my front porch because I would have been awful. Where's my $50? Hey, I didn't sell you the book. I just created the stuff. Yeah.
Well, thank you again, and we hope that when we get to the next volumes, we'll have you back, and definitely when we get to the motion picture, we will talk about the book that you helped put together in a similar fashion of the newspaper comics that were from, I believe, the LA Times.
LA Times, yeah, from 79 to 83. Funny story, just to connect those to the 2, so that this is in the same ballpark here. I only found out that these things even existed because I used to say, yeah, I've got every Star Trek comic ever made. I've got them all. And then one day, my friend, Ben Sasteradoyo, a college friend, went to a convention and came home one day and handed me an issue of TV 21. He said, you know what this is? And I just sort of blink. I mean, I just sort of looked at him like, what is this? I kind of had the same reaction Major Barrett Roddenberry had, I imagine. And so my first thought was, well, all right, I don't know what this is, but there couldn't really be that many. Oh my God, it's issue 102. So I said, there's at least 101 other of these. What the hell are these things? And that led me on this big research path. And while I was trying to track all these things down, I came across accidentally the fact that there were also these US strips, and I just sort of did a Darth Vader, and no. I mean, the hunt was back on, and that was great, but I clearly did not have all the comics like I claimed. So it took me years, and I got them all, and then that was kind of how I approached these publishers. Look, I've got them all. I think I have them all. For all I know, there's 16 issues in Canada at this point that I haven't found. But as far as I know, I've got them all, and that was how I approached them. And so, yeah, so that'll be a nice thing to talk about next, which is technically the U.S. strips were reprinted first, but they take place later on in the timeline.
Right. And Aaliyah, I believe, is still in the show, even though she shouldn't be.
She's in a couple of strips because the artist and writer Tom Warkentin hadn't yet seen the movie. He had the script and he knew the story well, but he didn't know that Aaliyah was the bald-headed woman until he saw the movie. He thought she was just like no one told him that bald-headed woman is the woman who disappears at the end. And when he went to the theater, I spoke to his widow, Rosemary Warkentin, and she told me that he was all excited. He'd been drawing these things for a while and turning them in, and they both got in the first day. They were standing in line, and he sits down. He's like, "Wait a minute, oh, good God," because he's realizing he just been drawing the pretty bald woman that he'd seen in pictures. He's like, "But I have her. Oh, this is not good." And so he got to the movie, and of course, she disappears, and he goes, all right, I'm going to just do what they did with David Bailey and just remove her. And hopefully nobody noticed what I did. But, yeah. But unlike the UK strips, he actually really did know Star Trek.
Yeah.
It shows. This was just a case of not having put 2 and 2 together. pretty woman on the Enterprise, pretty bald woman in a picture. I guess he didn't realize until he saw the movie they were the same person.
That's funny. Well, those kind of stories is what makes our show. So I'm glad they exist. So thank you so much, and we will and thank you for stopping by the Wood Panel Den, and we will see you next time.
Wood paneling is always worth coming to.
Bye.
All right, bye.
Well, the Fonz traveling through space and time isn't the only thing we've been talking about on Trek FM this week. Here's a peek at some of the things you may have missed elsewhere on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, the Orb.
It's not a primitive culture, right? The Bajorians are not a primitive culture. They're actually a very mature culture that has moved beyond our technological phase and found a way to have balance in their lives again.
Literary Treks.
The big difference is when you're doing nonfiction books, the way we do a lot of interviewing, and the interviewing requires a lot of transcribing tapes, and that's possibly the most miserable job one could ever run into. It's a real task.
The 602 Club.
It is time for us to explore Superman and the questions about him in a new and different way in the context of the world in which we live. And that's what Snyder is doing. People just don't like it because, you know what? Superman hasn't changed, but the world in which Superman's trying to serve has.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So check out the shows and get in on the daily Trek Talk. You'll find them in iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, and the Windows Podcast Directory for Xbox and Zune. You can check out our website at Trek.fm and view our podcast directory and stream all of our shows right from the website. We'd also like to ask you to leave us a review and ratings in iTunes. Not only does it help us know how we're doing, it also helps other people find the show. Before we go, I'd like to thank our Patreon members, Mike Bovia, Eric Extreme, and Ju Kim. Thank you for your support. We couldn't do it without you. And if you want to become an associate producer of a Trek FM show, all you need to do is become a patron of the network, the $25 or more level. Go to patreon.com/TrekFM and find out how you can become part of the team. That's patreon.com/TrekFM. Normally at the end of the show, I'd encourage everyone to get up and get out of the Wood Panel Den, but I've got a stack of comics here that I need to get through, so I'm going to pull out this long box and see what's been piling up. Crisis on Infinite Earths. That sounds interesting. Oh, and remember, there is an animated series.
We now return with Fonz and the Happy Days gang.